When we talk about nuclear risk, we usually default to hardware, missile ranges, warhead counts, treaty frameworks, verification regimes. But some of the most consequential shifts are no longer happening in silos or systems. They are happening in information environments, in narratives around capability, intent, and responsibility. And in the nuclear domain, those narratives matter in a very specific way. They shape how crises are interpreted under conditions where decision time is measured in minutes. This episode asks a simple question: is disinformation now embedded within nuclear risk itself? I'm Dr. Ian Fleming Zhou, and this is the Nuclear Table. Today, I'm joined by researchers from the Open Nuclear Network working on the global partnership WMD Counter-Disinformation project. Before we get into it, I'll ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and your role in this work.
I'm Valeria Hesse, a research analyst and disinformation expert at Open Nuclear Network. We are a program of Pax Sapiens, a nonprofit foundation dedicated to preventing predictable global catastrophes. ONA's goal is to reduce the risks associated with nuclear weapons. We monitor early indicators of nuclear risk through open sources, anticipate emerging threats. This is through forecasting and foresight tools. We provide deep analysis and engage decision makers to help reduce escalation risks. Thank you very much for inviting us.
Hi everyone, I'm Elin Bergner, a research coordinator at ONN, and I'm also an integration coordinator for the Counter-Disinformation initiative, from where much of the findings that we'll share here today comes from. It is the global partnership Counter-VMD Disinformation initiative, which was pioneered and funded by Global Affairs Canada, and is implemented by the Johns Hopkins Centre for Health Security in King's College London, who focus on the chem and biodisinformation, and then us at ONN focusing on the nuclear and radiological aspects. So very excited to be here today and share our insights.
Good morning, everyone. And Ian, thank you very much for having us. My name is Raymond Goff, and I'm also a research analyst at Open Nuclear Network. I work on the same radiological and nuclear disinformation as Valeria, but additionally, I also analyze satellite imagery analysis and I analyze and monitor nuclear related activities. I also help other ONN teams to forecast risk around nuclear weapons use and conventional escalation. And I'm very happy to be here today.
Valeria, Raymond, Ellen, welcome to the Nuclear Table.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let me start with the foundational question, because before we get into mechanisms and cases, we need to establish why this is even on the nuclear policy agenda. The nuclear field has traditionally defined risk in technical and strategic terms. Disinformation doesn't fit neatly into those categories. So, Valeria, to start with you, why should nuclear policy stakeholders care about this right now? And what makes radiological and nuclear disinformation a special case?
So, nuclear policy stakeholders should care about this information because it presents direct risks for their work. Disinformation, as you said, is not just about false information circulating in public sphere. It's not just a communication problem. It is about the behavioral and policy consequences that follow. Let's take a step back. Disinformation is false or inaccurate information deliberately spread to shape perception and behavior of the intended audience. So, nuclear policy stakeholders, the audience we're talking about, can range from state affiliated actors, such as political leadership, diplomats, regulatory authorities, emergency responders, militaries. They can also be institutions, such as, of course, in our sphere, the NPT review process and the IAEA, but also regional ones like AFCON or ACN. It also can be industry representatives, supply chain, and export control actors. It can be research and NGO sector, and of course, the general public itself. While the last one might sound a little bit surprising, nuclear policy cannot be sustained without public mandate. And even autocracies, in fact, depend on performance based credibility and their strengths narratives, their power narratives. For example, the aftermath of Chernobyl and Fukushima shows that policy trajectories shift not only because of the revised technical assessments, but because public perception and trust can change deeply as well. Because radiological nuclear issues are technically complex and associated with secrecy, they tap into deep survival fears. They're particularly vulnerable to manipulation. Nuclear policy stakeholders, therefore, should care about disinformation because it has already affected all of them to different extents. It can, for example, distort perceptions of intent, also capability, compliance. It can erode confidence in international institutions and actually complicate crisis communication. And it also can divert major resources to debunking. It can skew policy decisions. And in extreme cases, it can destabilize whole societies if left unaddressed.
Valeria, that point about policy trajectory shifting not just because of technical reassessments, but because of how public trust changes, that is a critical insight because it tells us that disinformation does not need to be delivered by decision makers themselves to have a destabilizing effect. It only needs to reshape the environment in which those decision makers operate. And that environment increasingly includes multilateral fora, digital platforms, and domestic political pressures simultaneously. Which takes me to the project itself. Ellen, when did the GPWMD Counter Disinformation Project start, and what was missing in the existing research and policy space that made this initiative necessary?
Sure, let me walk you through that. So, the G7 led 31 member global partnership against the spread of weapons and materials of mass destruction, which is just GP for short, established the GP Counter VMD Disinformation Initiative back in 2024 to collaborate on efforts to counter the threats CBRN weapons and related materials pose to international security. This is because the threat was growing, but our collective responses were not yet keeping pace. And CBRN disinformation was becoming more coordinated, more persistent, while at the same time, research and policy efforts remain too siloed, right? And so our aim has been to help close that gap by building evidence, connecting work across domains, supporting more resilient responses, especially in the radiological and nuclear space. In the chemical and biological space, disinformation had already been visible for some time, say particularly in relation, for example, to chemical weapons used in Syria, biological narratives during the COVID-19 pandemic. But in the radiological and nuclear domain, this was still a relatively new area, and nuclear policy communities had not yet fully recognized disinformation as a risk factor with the potential to affect crisis stability and diplomacy. And so, really, our efforts to counter CBRN disinformation existed, but they were largely siloed by domain. And there was no unified evidence base across the chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear issues. And so, in the nuclear space in particular, disinformation was often treated as a communications challenge rather than as a factor that could influence escalation dynamics or institutional trust. And there was also limited understanding of how disinformation was already shaping discussions in multilateral fora. And so the initiative brings together cross-sectoral partners to build a more systematic understanding of CBRN disinformation across these domains. And he tries to move beyond only reactive debunking towards anticipation and resilience building. And the work itself is structured around identifying narratives, analyzing them, understanding their political impact, and strengthening institutional responses. And so for nuclear stakeholders specifically, this initiative helps understand disinformation not as a peripheral issue, right, but as something that can influence trust and decision making, especially in crisis situations in the radiological and the nuclear domain.
That phrase, moving beyond reactive debunking, captures the fundamental inadequacy of where the field currently sits. Debunking is by definition a response to something that is already spread. And in a domain where a narrative can circulate globally in minutes and where the psychological effects of even a false claim about a nuclear incident can reshape how states interpret each other's intentions, arriving after the fact is arriving too late. But before we get to responses, I want to make sure we understand the full scope of vulnerability. What are the main spaces and stakeholders who are most exposed to radiological and nuclear disinformation?
So, as Ian mentioned, radiological and nuclear disinformation exploits the very setup of international governance. It can target state delegations, for example, by accusing them of concealing treaty violations or escalating tensions under the guise of self defense, or, for example, acting as proxies of foreign interests. Such information environment can thereby weaken delegations' credibility and isolate them, also complicating coalition building. Radiological and nuclear disinformation can also put pressure on national governments by exploiting delays in coordination among agencies. Or if they try to provide cautious technical responses, they can be framed as incompetent or, uh, for example, providing a cover up. Disinformation can also undermine international organizations by portraying their impartial verification and probabilistic language as bias or complicity, which can erode trust in the institutions that are fundamental to the nonproliferation regime. At the same time, an important aspect now is that the boundary between diplomatic fora and the public sphere is now becoming more and more porous. The narratives that are launched in multilateral settings can be amplified online, feeding domestic pressure and reshaping how states interpret each other's actions.
In terms of spaces, I think that there's an ongoing issue around how social media platforms are actually structured. So, first off, online media rewards things like emotional intensity, speed, and simple messages that sound certain to a particular audience. The second point is radiological and nuclear issues are already topics that invoke high levels of anxiety as they discuss issues such as dirty bombs, reactor meltdowns, or maybe secret nuclear tests. And these emotion inducing narratives, they tend to travel much farther and much faster than some of the technical and careful clarification that organizations such as ourselves and others that are working within the sector are able to provide. The third issue is around cross platform amplification. And what this means is that a narrative might begin within fringe communities, but algorithms will then pick this narrative up and give it more attention. They'll amplify it, and it will be shown to more and more people. And because of this, these narratives end up migrating from once fringe communities into more mainstream discourse. And sometimes we've actually seen that they can even be picked up by state officials or traditional media. And so this is why I think online spaces deserve specific attention in this space.
Yes, I think from my perspective, when we examine vulnerability to our disinformation, gender dynamics are an important but oftentimes overlooked factor. First of all, nuclear discourse, as we know, is already shaped by gender ideas about strength, control, and rationality. And these ideas influence how actors are perceived as credible, responsible, capable in high-stakes security contexts. For example, in the war in Ukraine, gender disinformation has been used to shape those perceptions. Some examples being narratives that feminize Ukrainian leadership or portray Ukraine as morally corrupt or aligned with so-called degenerate Western values, putting this in quotation marks, such as LGBTQ. And we should not see these only as just cultural attacks. They are designed to undermine credibility and the picked adversary as weak, irrational, or incapable of responsible governance. And then this kind of framing can then be used to justify stronger and more aggressive actions. And if an opponent then is portrayed as reckless or morally compromised, escalation, including all the way up to nuclear signaling, can be reframed not as aggression, but as a necessary and protective response. And then secondly, women, as we know, remain underrepresented in nuclear science, security, and diplomacy. And this structural imbalance reinforces a credibility gap. And gender disinformation leveraged this through attacks questioning women's competence or legitimacy in technical and security role, but also through increasing the professional and psychological costs of participation, which can ultimately narrow the diversity of voices in nuclear decision-making spaces. And then finally, in radiological crisis context, gender also shapes how information is accessed and trusted. And so during the Fukushima disaster, for example, many women, particularly mothers, sought information about reproductive health and risk to children. And when official communication did not directly address these concerns, some turned to informal networks. And that created space for misleading claims to circulate more easily. For example, exaggerated risks to fertility and to children and so on. And there was also conflicting advice on food safety, etc. And all of this resulted in an increased anxiety, of course, also reduced trust in official communication, and in some cases, even behavioral changes based on this incomplete or inaccurate information. And of course, in a deliberate disinformation campaign, those same dynamics could be exploited to amplify fear, to undermine trust in authorities, and to complicate emergency responses.
That last point is very important. You are describing a vulnerability that is not accidental, it is structural. The same features that make nuclear communication difficult in good faith, the technical complexity, the secrecy, the institutional caution, become attack surfaces in a deliberate disinformation campaign. And the populations most likely to seek information through informal networks during a crisis are often the least saved by official communication. That is not a communications failure, it is a design problem in how nuclear governance thinks about the public. Now, I want to move from the structural vulnerabilities to what this actually looks like on the ground. Ray, if you can jump in for a second, what does radiological and nuclear disinformation look like in practice? What are the cases and why do they matter?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ian. I think it's a really interesting and important one. So, RN disinformation targets many actors, often in very distinct geographic regions. But there are, I guess, two prominent examples that come to mind and I think are worth discussing today. So, let's start with the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Since Russia occupied the plant in early 2022, accusations around shelling at the facility have been essentially constant, with both sides blaming the other for the incidents. And this has led to widespread confusion amongst many audiences around what is actually going on and who is actually responsible for the strikes. And this ambiguity is really important in nuclear discourse because disinformation thrives in uncertain situations. And a contested nuclear site in the middle of a war is almost a perfect environment for narrative manipulation to occur. When you layer on top of this historical memory of other radiological accidents like Chernobyl or the Fukushima disaster in Japan, then these narratives can begin to carry a lot of psychological weight. And it's within this particular environment that two narratives have stood out in prominence. The first of these is a narrative that really reframes Russia's military presence at Zaporizhia nuclear power plant as a protective measure rather than aggression. And in this narrative, control of the power plant is presented not as an occupation, but actually as a form of nuclear risk management, with Russia essentially saying that it's there as a stabilizing force to prevent catastrophes from occurring. And this is quite a subtle but a powerful shift in framing because it moves the framing from a violation of state sovereignty into a promotion of safety. And the second narrative, this is one that works by portraying Ukraine as a reckless or incapable actor when it comes to managing its nuclear infrastructure. And over time, some of the research that we've done has demonstrated that this kind of messaging has the effect of eroding international confidence and casting doubt on Ukraine's competence in the nuclear safety areas. The second example that I wanted to give happened in 2024. And this was when two pretty large earthquakes occurred in northern Iran. And almost as soon as these earthquakes occurred, online disinformation narratives started to circulate, which began claiming that Iran had conducted a covert nuclear test. And the intent of this disinformation was to spread panic and potentially add into the discourse concerns of Israeli escalation. Now, in this particular instance, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, which is a bit of a mouthful, they provided technical clarification and analysis on the seismic data which they had access to, and they were able to confirm to a very high level of accuracy that the signals that they saw were consistent with a natural earthquake rather than a nuclear detonation, which produces a very distinctive seismic signature. And in this case, the technical clarification that the CTBTO provided, it really helped to contain this disinformation narrative and shift the discourse away from some of the false information that we were seeing. But I think that this particular narrative also illustrates a concerning broader trend that we're seeing. And that's that radiological and nuclear disinformation is growing in its reach and its sophistication. And because of this, neutral verification bodies such as the CTBTO and the IEA are increasingly being drawn into what are quite politicized information battles. And this creates its own risk because over time, if these organizations are repeatedly forced into providing public rebuttals against a specific actor, then they can increasingly become targets themselves of disinformation narratives because the disinformation actor realizes that it could be good for them to start portraying these technical authorities, which are nominally neutral, as partisan actors. So, in practice, RN disinformation can take on several different forms. And because of how varied it is, a very diverse range of debunking strategies are needed to fully address the issue.
Ray, you said something earlier that I think sits at the center of this conversation. Disinformation thrives in uncertainty. And that's exactly where nuclear risk lives. A contested facility, a seismic signal, an accusation that can be verified in real time. These are environments where decisions are made before clarity exists. What this means is that disinformation is not just a peripheral irritant to nuclear governance, it is structurally embedded in the highest risk scenarios. You cannot separate the information environment from the risk environment, they are the same environment. Let me ask you this. What helped you actually analyze that, and why did the Open Nuclear Network take a cross sectoral approach rather than staying within nuclear case studies?
So, one of the key insights from our work is that radiological nuclear disinformation does not really behave differently from disinformation in other domains. It relies on the same psychological triggers and targeting strategies. That matters because it means nuclear stakeholders are exposed to the same influence mechanisms. And cross-sectoral approach means that we deliberately step outside of this nuclear silo. And instead of analyzing RN disinformation only through the cases of radiological and nuclear disinformation, we also asked a more fundamental question. How does disinformation work as a phenomenon? What does that mean to the radiological and nuclear domain? So we drew on psychology, media studies, political marketing, strategic communication, and information technologies. Basically, the disciplines that have studied how disinformation, sorry, basically the disciplines that have studied how information influences perception and behavior to understand the mechanisms that lie underneath specific narratives. And then we mapped the research across all those disciplines I mentioned. And when that happened, there were three recurring and interlinked dimensions that we observed: design, spread, and experience. Design is about influence tactics used to construct and frame narratives. Spread is more about dissemination strategies that can extend reach and visibility of a particular narrative. And then experience is what happens inside the minds of audiences when they face such narratives, especially under stress, and how then it translates into behavior. Let's start with psychology. Um, Psychology helps explain why this all works. And as I said, under crisis conditions, people process information differently, less critically. Stress narrows their attention, and people rely more on emotion and some sort of mental shortcuts called actually cognitive biases. In such circumstances, simple, clear, repeated messages feel more familiar and become, therefore, perceived as truer. Group dynamics also play a role. When information aligns with group identity, people tend to embrace it, and vice versa. When it challenges their identity, it can be easily rejected, even when like the evidence is strong. So corrective messages can fail against disinformation, not because they lack evidence, but because they are perceived as threatening people's values or affiliation, or the messages are framed in such a way that makes them processed easily. If we turn to media studies, that actually helps explain why certain narratives dominate the info space. In fast moving environments, media organizations face so called speed versus accuracy trade offs, which means that they often can disseminate information before any type of verification can be done. And it also is followed by dramatic framing or compelling visuals and triggers certain emotions. Also, personalized storytelling through audience segmentation and targeting make narratives travel faster than technical nuance, because just simply it's more interesting than technical detail. Um, so it actually takes effort for and time for technical information to be translated into accessible language for broader public, right? So once early interpretation takes hold, it shapes how all subsequent information is processed. Furthermore, repetition, as I mentioned before, when it happens across digital platforms and traditional outlets, creates feedback loops that reinforce each other. And so media try to present a balance of views, which can often lead to citing sources out of context or citing experts beyond their area of expertise, which can, in certain situations, unintentionally elevate some fringe claims. One of the things that can be borrowed from political marketing is that today messaging is rarely generic. It is segmented, it is targeted. Narratives can be tailored to ideological leanings, emotional vulnerabilities, values, and other identity markers of people. In RN context, this means that for people, for example, emergency guidance can be reframed as political control, or verification reports can be framed as geopolitical bias. The aim is not always persuasion. It is frequently polarization of societies. It is frequently to sow doubt and, for example, demobilize the opponent's audience. Strategic communication reminds us that trust is the foundation under all of this. Emergency messaging works when audiences believes that institutions are competent and acting in their interest. However, when societal trust is fragile, alternative explanations can gain space. And transparent messaging that acknowledges uncertainty, clarifies what is known and unknown, and empowers audiences to act on the information that they have can reduce that gap because people kind of feel that they gain the control back. At the same time, you don't necessarily need to respond to every low level narrative because you can unintentionally amplify it. So there have to be thresholds to when you react to certain disinformation. As said, disinformation often connects to identity and values. And so strategic communication actually teaches us that we need to take that into consideration because you cannot simply, again, as said, debunk something that is connected to the person's identity was just a dry technical message. And the last, but definitely not the least, is information technology. Automation, generative AI, coordinated networks, and amplification through algorithms mean that narratives can cross borders just instantly. Synthetic media make false claims more visually convincing. There are also influencer style communicators that can rival institutional voices and have a broader reach because they spend time to build trust and emotional connection with their audience. As we know, algorithms reward engagement, definitely not accuracy. So the more people just simply engage with that content, the further it spreads. When you bring all this together, you see why a purely nuclear case study approach would not have been enough. An incident can be handled absolutely correctly from the technical standpoint, and the verification may be absolutely sound. However, the outcome can still be destabilizing if the surrounding information environment confuses audiences. That's why understanding the mechanisms of influence, not just the content, was necessary.
That distinction between mechanisms of influence and content is where I think your research makes its most important contribution because it reframes the entire problem. If you are only looking at the content of disinformation, the specific false claim, then your response is always going to be reactive. You debunk this claim, another one emerges. But if you understand the mechanisms, the psychological triggers, the dissemination strategies, the way repetition manufactures familiarity and familiarity manufactures perceived truth, then you can begin to build something more durable than a fact check. And this becomes especially relevant in multilateral settings, as we pointed out earlier. So, what can your approach tell us about how disinformation affects such settings? Are multilateral institutions structurally equipped to respond?
A cross-sectorial approach absolutely does apply to multilateral fora. You have formal procedures, constrained timelines, high visibility, and politically sensitive negotiations. At the same time, these fora no longer function in isolation. For example, statements delivered at an event can be clipped and reframed online within minutes. That means the design, spread, and experience dynamics we identified do not stop at the conference room door. From a design perspective, multilateral institutions and state delegations can have characteristics that can be exploited. Diplomatic language is cautious, verification language is probabilistic, mandates often restrict attribution or commentary beyond technical findings. So, disinformation can weaponize all those features and reframe caution as concealment or impartiality as bias. Our research shows how delegations can be portrayed as deceptive or as proxies of foreign interests. National apparatuses can be framed as incoherent or conspiring to proliferate, and international organizations actually can be accused of complicity or political alignments when they are, in fact, acting just within their mandate. In terms of spread, multilateral settings are highly networked environments. Statements, right of reply statements, closed door negotiations, working papers, side events, also informal briefings, all create entry points for narrative manipulation. At the same time, media reporting and digital platforms form part of the same ecosystem. Content can circulate through diplomatic channels and digital platforms simultaneously, creating what are essentially feedback loops between formal diplomacy and public discourse. That also increases pressure on institutions and delegations, presses them to respond quickly, and sometimes before any verification is complete. From the experience perspective, delegations often negotiate under intense time pressures with small teams, and also national ministries need to align across agencies before they can speak publicly on certain issues. Within international organizations, it is imperative to secure internal clearance before any statement can be issued. In fact, these features protect accuracy, yet a contested information environment can turn them against the institutions themselves. A delayed response can be portrayed and perceived as evasion, and careful language can be framed and viewed, after all, as a concealment. Ordinary coordination processes can be exaggerated into signs of internal division, for example. So, when such interpretations circulate repeatedly, they begin to erode confidence, not only in specific actors, but in the credibility of the system as a whole. So, the second question that you asked was, are multilateral institutions equipped to respond? I would say at present, preparedness is uneven and often, really often reactive. Many institutions have strong technical expertise, which is a huge benefit, but limited capacity to anticipate, monitor, analyze, and counter disinformation. There are bureaucratic bottlenecks, including, as I said, public communication approval chains. And neutrality mandates can slow down the response. At the same time, these institutions do have important advantages. They have formal authority, they have access to expertise, and they have established communication channels. And also convening power, which is important when it comes to disseminating correct information. So, to take a step back, the core vulnerability is that disinformation is not yet consistently recognized within multilateral nuclear governance as a structural threat or risk. Also, as Elon mentioned, it is often approached as a communications irritant, not as an actual threat. So, this under recognition creates a gap. When a risk is not clearly defined, it is unlikely to receive dedicated resources, also unlikely to receive formal operating procedures. So, part of what we are trying to do is making the threat itself more visible and better understood. The cross sectoral approach does apply, and multilateral institutions are not inherently ill equipped. They are, however, structurally constrained. So, without deliberate investment in foresight, monitoring, analysis, communication strategy, and what is even more important, staff, those constraints can really be exploited.
I want to stay on that point. Disinformation has already reshaped elections, public health responses, institutional trust. And yet, in the nuclear space, where the stakes are arguably the highest, it's still often treated as a secondary issue. That gap is a vulnerability in itself. I would really love to hear Ray's perspective on this. Can radiological and nuclear disinformation actually trigger real world escalation, or is that risk overstated?
Yeah, well, the short answer is yes. Unfortunately, the risk is not overstated. So our research, it demonstrates that radiological and nuclear disinformation can actually become entangled in some of these escalation dynamics, and that under certain circumstances, it can contribute directly to real world crisis instability too. So, one of the clearest examples occurred in the autumn of 2022. And at this time, Russian forces were suffering significant battlefield setbacks in Ukraine. And there was serious discussions within Russia that the front lines might collapse, which could lead to a decisive battlefield defeat for them. And it was in this context, which was a moment of extreme vulnerability for the Kremlin, that a disinformation narrative began to circulate that claimed that Ukraine was planning to detonate a dirty bomb on its own territory and blame Russia for the incident. Now, this narrative, it wasn't entirely new, and our research showed that variations of the narrative had actually circulated at low levels for many years. But what made this particularly alarming was that at this time, in the autumn of 2022, the narrative stopped being confined to fringe actors, and we actually saw several senior Russian military officials and President Putin himself publicly raise these allegations of a Ukrainian dirty bomb threat. Now, within the West, this raised some alarming possibilities. They began to suspect that Russia could be using this narrative as a pretext to use tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield and to attribute the incident to a Ukrainian dirty bomb. And just to phone home how serious this was, Western capitals were so concerned about this threat that they initiated some really intense back channel diplomacy with many of their counterparts, both in India and China, in an attempt, I guess, to convince Moscow that it was not going to be worth the cost for them to escalate to nuclear weapons use. And at the same time as we were seeing this, there were also a whole lot of military contingency plans being drawn up, as well as strike options that were being prepared in the case that Russia would cross that threshold and use nuclear weapons on the battlefield, and so that the West had plans where they could respond with conventional military action in order to restore that deterrence. So, specifically to answer the question about whether disinformation can trigger escalation, well, in this instance, I think it is a definitive yes. Disinformation can create a narrative of imminent threat. It can provide rhetorical justification for potentially extreme actions, including nuclear weapons use. It can trigger military contingency planning from the other side. In this case, it was the West. And it can also increase mistrust and compress decision making timelines.
Ray, what you have just described is not hypothetical, it's a real escalation pathway, right? A narrative moves from the margins to the highest levels of state discourse, and within weeks, other states are responding as if the threat is real. That's the distance between disinformation and crisis, and it's shorter than we tend to assume. So, given that, what role can independent expert communities play in countering radiological and nuclear disinformation? Because states are constrained by political positioning, institutions are constrained by mandate and neutrality requirements. Where does independent expertise actually make a difference?
Thank you for that question, Ian. I think there's quite a few different roles that we can play. First, I like to bring up credible translation and de escalation. Now, what I mean with this is that nuclear issues are technically complex, they're emotionally charged, and so during crisis, ambiguity fuels speculation. And so, what independent experts can do here is to translate highly technical developments, for example, radiation readings, missile test data, treaty compliance claims, etc., into accessible and accurate explanations. And I think that translation function to reduce space for panic, misinterpretation, or deliberate distortion. Because independent experts are not formally representing a state position, they may be perceived as more neutral. which can help dampen polarization as well. And so in nuclear context, even small misinterpretation can have outside consequences. And by clarifying technical realities, experts can help prevent rhetorical escalation from hardening into policy escalation. Secondly, I would say maintaining public trust. Public trust in nuclear governance depends on credible intermediaries, and independent experts can serve as a bridge between institutions and society. Transparent, evidence-based communication reinforces democratic legitimacy in nuclear policymaking. Thirdly, expert can also reinforce multilateral stability. As we know, multilateral fora depends on shared factual baselines, and so when false allegations are introduced, for example, regarding weapons development, independent experts can provide open source verification, and this can strengthen transparency while avoiding politicized confrontations. Experts can also brief diplomats informally, helping them navigate technically complex claims, and they can do so in real time. And finally, independent expert communities can also do things that states often cannot do or cannot do credibly. Governments are constrained by political positioning and diplomatic sensitivities, whereas, of course, independent experts can analyze and respond to emerging narratives without being perceived as necessarily defending a national line. And so they can convene cross-border networks, foster informal dialogue across geopolitical divides, collaborate with digital integrity actors in ways that are more flexible and less politicized. They're also well placed to conduct sustained research that states might not prioritize or might not be able to prioritize, including examining, for example, how gendered and intersectional dynamics shape vulnerability to foreign disinformation, how it shapes who's disproportionately targeted, and how crisis communication can be made more inclusive, as we spoke about before. So by generating evidence-based recommendations, strengthening transnational professional networks, independent experts help states build resilience, not only against individual falsehoods, but also against systemic erosion of trust in the nuclear governance architecture itself.
The systemic erosion of trust in the nuclear governance architecture. I want to pause on that before we move to solutions because that erosion is not hypothetical. It's already happening as we speak. We see it in the NPT review processes struggling to reach consensus, in the widening trust gap between nuclear and non nuclear states, and in the increasing strain on institutions like the International Atomic Energy Agency. And into that already fragile environment, disinformation acts as an accelerant. So let me ask, what has been the most surprising insight from this research?
I can jump in on this one. So, two insights really stood out to me, and I found them absolutely fascinating. First of all, the core vulnerability is human psychology. You would not think that it would be, but it is, even in such a really high level sphere. So, the mechanisms that drive radiological nuclear disinformation, even in multilateral fora, are those same ones that we see in elections or public health, for example. Fear, identity alignment often outweigh technical accuracy because under pressure, people gravitate towards simple and emotionally resonant narratives. That means that technically sound response can still struggle if the surrounding information environment is noisy and lacks trust. The second interesting and surprising insight for me is that radiological nuclear disinformation is rarely just an isolated falsehood. It actually frequently operates through narrative framing, so to say. It can weave in propaganda, conspiracies, also other similar phenomena. And yeah, we can take an example of contrast messaging like, oh, we are responsible and constructive, and they are reckless and dangerous. It may look like simple propaganda, yet it can function as part of the larger story that positions one actor as the guarantor of nonproliferation while also casting others as destabilizing. Radiological nuclear disinformation often also reuses past disinformation. It can already be even debunked, and it is not even specific to the nuclear field. However, it can be a reinterpretation of historical events or the inversion of responsibility for conflict that kind of gets weaved in into the RN context. And as said, over time, repetition turns these reframed historical claims into reference points. Um, Here, the power lies really less in a single fabricated fact and more in the layered narrative that makes the overall story feel coherent, morally intuitive, and of course, as said, in repetition, repetition, repetition.
One of the most surprising insights for me was how multi-layered and adaptive the disinformation ecosystem can be. I think we often think about disinformation as a single false claim produced by a specific actor, right? But what we've observed was something much more systemic. In some contexts, state actors, affiliated media, online influencers, fringe outlets, and automated amplification mechanism, they operate almost in symphony. And so what's particularly striking is how narratives mutate as they move. For example, a deliberate fabricated claim can originate with a state-linked source. That is clear disinformation. But then as it spreads, it can be picked up by individuals who believe it to be true, at which point it becomes misinformation. And that organic circulation then gives it the appearance of authenticity or grassroots concern. And it may later be re-amplified by political actors or official channels, which then returns it to the realm of strategic disinformation, but then now with some greater legitimacy and reach. And so the boundaries between state and non-state actors and between disinformation and misinformation becomes blurred. And what you're facing is not necessarily a single source, but rather this dynamic ecosystem in which different actors play complementary roles in producing, legitimizing, amplifying, and embedding narratives into diplomatic and multilateral discourse. I think that multi-layered structure makes countering RN disinformation significantly more complex than just simple debunking.
Yeah, for me, I think the most surprising insight has been just how convincing some of these narratives can be. And many of the actors behind these campaigns really understand how effective it is to combine things like emotional language and technical complexity together. So, nuclear issues already carry quite a high barrier to understanding. And then when you layer in things like selective data and official terminology on top of that, these disinformation narratives can start to feel really credible, even if they are misleading. And repetition has a powerful effect too. The more people encounter a claim, the more familiar it starts to feel. And that familiarity over a longer period of time can translate into perceptions of truth, even if it's just on a subconscious level.
Ray, that point about repetition is critical because it lowers the bar for what a successful disinformation campaign looks like. It's not about convincing people, it's about making something feel familiar enough to be accepted in a crisis. And when you combine that with how information actually spreads today, fast, visual, algorithm driven, the scale of the challenge becomes very clear. So, to what extent are current counter disinformation efforts delivering real impact, and where is there room to strengthen their practical outcomes? What best practices should guide more effective responses going forward?
Brilliant question, Ian. I would say that current counter disinformation efforts are beginning to deliver impact, but the field is still very much maturing. And I would say so, particularly in the radiological and nuclear domain. One tangible sign of progress that we have observed, though, through the Global Partnership VNB Counter Disinformation Initiative, is a shift in awareness among diplomatic delegations participating in international fora. So, through workshops and engagement, we have seen a change. Delegates are increasingly recognizing that disinformation can affect the trust between states, they can complicate negotiations, and that it can shape how allegations are introduced and debated also in multilateral settings. And I think this shift in awareness matters, right? Because you cannot build resilience against something that you have not first conceptualized as a diplomatic and strategic risk in the first place. But of course, at the same time, as we discussed, there's still plenty of room to strengthen the practical outcomes.
If I'm being candid, I think right now we're really struggling. I wouldn't say that we're winning the fight against disinformation. And in many cases, the countering efforts that we see still feel reactive, maybe fragmented, and often just plainly too slow. From my experience looking at Ukraine, I think one of the biggest realizations is that if a piece of disinformation already aligns with someone's existing ideological framing or their worldview, then debunking it is just incredibly difficult. And what's also striking, I found, is that people who might be relatively resilient to disinformation in one context can be extremely vulnerable in another context. Someone who might easily spot disinformation about Ukraine, for example, could be far more susceptible when it comes to a different geopolitical theater, such as the Israel Gaza conflict, because their emotional or the ideological lenses in these two cases are quite different. And I think that this tells us something important because what we're dealing with here isn't just a problem with information, the information that's been spread. It's actually a cognitive and psychological issue as well. So then I think the question becomes, well, how can we improve? And I think first, we need to move beyond reactive debunking. Fact checking is, of course, necessary. There'll always be a place for that, but it alone is not sufficient. By the time you're done correcting a narrative, it may have already shaped perceptions and influenced hundreds, if not thousands, of different people. And second, I think we need to focus much more seriously on long term resilience. And basically, that means education, and not just in the media literacy as a vague sense, but teaching people and particularly teaching the next generation exactly how cognitive biases work, how repetition shapes belief, and how emotional triggers function. Only then, by understanding those mechanisms and integrating better digital literacy, only then, in my opinion, can we really start to get ahead of this curve.
So yes, as the guys highlighted, current counter disinformation efforts are improving, but their impact remains uneven and often reactive. Many governments and organizations do now recognize disinformation as a challenge, and there are now monitoring units, fact checking initiatives, strategic communication teams in place in some cases, not overall tendency. These tools do matter. They do help to detect emerging narratives and correct false claims. However, as Ray said, in practice, much of the response still focuses on debunking. So, one key necessary shift is from reaction to preparedness. This means scenario planning, narrative foresight, and also pre bunking before crises erupt. Institutions should anticipate likely frames and prepare some sort of a messaging that would be appropriate in advance rather than improvising under pressure, because we know that pressure and stress can create a challenging situation in terms of disinformation. So, structured monitoring, including some OSINT integrations, needs to be embedded. It should become routine operation rather than activated only during incidents. Another area for improvement is coordination. As we know already, disinformation exploits incoherence. When delegations, ministries, international organizations send fragmented or delayed signals, that gaps become part of the narrative. The trust is actually a deeper layer, but is very important. Effective countering is not just about correcting falsehood. It requires communication that is transparent, emotionally aware, identity sensitive, on top of being factual. So, institutions actually must be transparent in acknowledging uncertainty and explaining the processes, which can actually help build that trust. And finally, of course, resources need to match the recognition. If RN disinformation is understood as a risk, it will justify dedicated staff capacity and formal operating procedures. So, the best practice going forward is layered resilience. We need to proactively plan, we need to structure our monitoring, and actually coordinate response. Only then can counter disinformation efforts move from firefighting, so to say, to actual long term impact.
Ray, you used a phrase that I want to carry into the final question: long term resilience, not just fact checking, not just debunking, resilience. And I think that distinction is exactly the right frame for where we need to go, because the field has spent considerable energy on reactive responses, monitoring narratives after they emerge, correcting false claims after they spread, briefing diplomats after the damage has been done. And all of that has value. But if the underlying cognitive and institutional vulnerabilities remain unaddressed, then we are fighting the same battle at every crisis with the same tools against an adversary that is becoming more sophisticated and more coordinated, right? The question I would ask all of you is what it actually looks like to build resilience before the next crisis. What are the practical steps you would encourage states, institutions, academia, the expert community, basically all of us, to take right now?
If I had to boil it down to one thing, I think it would be understanding the psychological techniques that are being used here, particularly emotive responses. So, radiological and nuclear disinformation is really designed to trigger a reaction. This is usually fear or urgency, and it does this before you have time to think. And it does this because disinformation narratives rely on these emotional triggers and emotional responses in order to spread more effectively. So, slowing down, noticing that visceral reaction you get can make you far less susceptible to being deceived or accidentally and reactively amplifying something misleading yourself.
So I'm going to do the opposite of boiling it down, and I'm just going to go for 4 practical steps that I'd recommend. First of all, it would be to integrate disinformation risk into core nuclear work. This means that it should be built into policy planning, verification discussions, and crisis exercises from the very start. Secondly, build institutional habits of preparedness. This is done so that teams know in advance who speaks, how, and on what basis during a crisis. Thirdly, communicate with transparency and clarity. As we know, technical information needs to be accessible without losing accuracy. And in nuclear contexts, timely and clear communication can be seen as stabilizing. And finally, fourth, protect inclusion. Gendered and identity-based targeting can erode participation and trust. And so strengthening resilience means safeguarding diverse expert communities and ensuring crisis communication addresses different information needs. Those are my 4 takeaways.
So, I would highlight 3 very practical steps. First, as we have established, do not underestimate the threat. Um, Radiological nuclear disinformation is not a side issue. Treat it as an operational risk, not as background noise. Second, do not really rely on facts alone when countering it. As we have established as well, disinformation connects to emotion and identity. So response needs to be accurate, but also human and values based. At the same time, as we have established, strong critical thinking skills and solid trust are crucial. When they're in place, people are less likely to default to reflexive emotional reactions. And third, pre-bunking, think of it as inoculation, is really crucial. This means identifying your likely vulnerabilities in advance and mapping plausible disinformation scenarios. Because the first version of the story people hear often becomes the baseline against which everything else is judged. By proactively communicating risks, processes, values before false claims can even emerge, you set the baseline yourself. So any later distortion is far less persuasive. And finally, each of us shapes the information environment through what we amplify, question, debunk, ignore. Strengthening strengthening that awareness in our own circles is part of the solution as well. Sorry, strengthening the awareness in our own circles is part of the solution that is readily available for everyone.
And with that, I would like to thank all of you for joining me today on the Nuclear Table.
Thank you so much, Ian, for having us here today and for providing us this platform to talk about our research. I really enjoyed your questions, and I hope we've gotten people a bit more interested in disinformation and how it can impact nuclear and radiological topics. So I just wanted to say as well then, if any one of our amazing listeners are interested in learning more about countering disinformation in the nuclear sphere, then please do consider heading over to the dpvmdcounterdisinfo.com website, where you will find a lot of our tools and publications of different kinds, as well as videos. So please head over to that. And again, thank you very much, Ian.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo that too. Thank you so much, Ian. I really found these discussions super interesting. And if you would like to learn more about our organization, please go to opennuclear.org and you can find out about all the good work we do in the disinformation space, but also some of the other awesome efforts that we're putting in to help make the world a safer place from nuclear risks. So, yeah, thanks again.
Thank you extremely much, Ian, for inviting us. It has been fun to be able to nerd out on something that we are really excited about. And yeah, we really see a solution to the risk that we are talking about. So we hope that people are going to become part of the solution as well.
What this conversation makes clear is that we are still thinking about nuclear risk in incomplete terms. Valeria pushed us to look beyond the content of disinformation to the mechanisms of influence, how narratives shape the environment in which decisions are made, regardless of whether decision makers themselves believe them. Ellen highlighted something equally important, that the vulnerabilities disinformation exploits are not incidental, they are structural. The opacity, the technical complexity, the caution that define nuclear governance also creates the conditions in which false narratives can take hold. And Ray's point stays with me that disinformation thrives in uncertainty. Because in the nuclear domain, uncertainty is not an exception, it is the operating condition, which means the environments where nuclear risk is highest are also the environments where disinformation is most effective. And once you see that, it becomes difficult to argue that disinformation sits outside nuclear risk. It doesn't, it is embedded within it. The question then is whether our responses reflect that reality, because what we have today is still largely reactive. Debunking after the fact, responding once a narrative has already shaped perception. But if decisions are being made in minutes, then a response that arrives after the narrative has taken hold is already late. So, the issue is not just whether we are countering disinformation, it is whether we are treating it as a structural component of nuclear risk management, with the resourcing, attention, and institutional integration that applies. Right now, it is not clear that we are. And that gap between how disinformation operates and how it is being addressed is itself a risk. This has been the Nuclear Table. Until next time.